Every debate about public safety and firearms relies on one major assumption, that focusing on legal retail sales is the key to stopping criminals. But you know what? The federal government's own data tells a completely different story. If you look at the hard numbers, broad bans actually miss the target entirely. Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're taking a strictly impartial, numbers-first look at the factual reality of firearms in society. We're stripping away all the partisan rhetoric to see what the data actually reveals. I've pinned the official government source links in the description below so you can read the raw data for yourself. Drop a comment with your thoughts on these metrics as we go, and make sure to follow for more unbiased, data-backed breakdowns. So, let's dive right in. The core question that drives almost all of these public safety debates is this: where do crime guns actually come from? It's a question that forces us to challenge our own assumptions and really look past the headlines. Well, according to the Bureau of Justice Statistics survey of state and federal prison inmates, the baseline reality is pretty startling. Less than 2% of armed offenders actually got their firearms directly from a legal retail store or a gun show. Less than 2%. Over 98% got them through alternative means. So the hard data suggests that the vast majority of criminal firearms exist entirely outside the traditional retail environment. Section 1. The criminal supply chain. If offenders aren't just walking into the local sporting goods store or a gun show to buy these things, how exactly are they getting them? Breaking down that federal prison data reveals the massive role of the underground black market, which accounts for roughly 43% of crime guns. Another 25% come from friends or family members, and about 6% come from direct theft, like a residential burglary. Added up, and over half of these offenders got their weapons completely illegally. Private social networks and illicit street markets are the true engines arming criminals, and they operate entirely outside the boundaries of legal retail commerce. So you might be wondering, how do guns get into that black market in the first place? Well, virtually all guns start in the legal, primary market. They're manufactured, imported, and sold by retail dealers. But then they cross over. Through theft, off-the-books sales, and illicit transfers, they move from authorized possessors into a secondary, underground market inhabited by prohibited possessors. It's essentially a complex shadow economy of informal exchanges. One of the major illicit pipelines supplying that secondary market we just mapped out is a concept you've probably heard of: the straw purchase. A straw purchase is a fundamentally illegal transaction where someone with a perfectly clean record buys a firearm specifically on behalf of someone who is legally prohibited from owning one. Law enforcement trace data tells us that these intermediaries, the straw purchasers and street brokers, are absolutely critical nodes bridging the gap between the legal retail counter and the criminal underground. Crucially, by the time a gun is used in crime, it's usually been circulating in the shadows for a really long time. A comprehensive study on Chicago's underground gun market by Cook and his colleagues found that the guns confiscated by police from gang members tend to be quite old, with a median age of over 10 years. So crime guns aren't typically brand new right out of the box. They bounce around the underground market for a decade or more, passing through multiple hands before they're ever recovered by law enforcement. Section 2. The geography of violence. Okay, we've looked at how the guns move. Now let's look at the hyper-concentrated locations where they are actually used. You might assume violence is spread out somewhat evenly across a struggling city, right? But criminological data shows us something entirely different. In Cincinnati's Pivot Program analysis, a mere 1.4% of the city's geographical area accounted for an astonishing 42.6% of all shootings. Think about that. Gun violence is hyper-concentrated in a tiny fraction of city blocks. We're talking about micro-locations, sometimes as small as a specific intersection, a convenience store parking lot, or a single apartment building, generating the vast majority of the violence. But it's not just about geography, it's about the individuals within those micro-locations. Research out of Chicago demonstrates that violence operates almost like a contagion, spreading through specific interconnected social networks. It is hyper-concentrated among networks already legally prohibited from owning guns, like rival street gangs. Your risk of victimization isn't just about your zip code. It's heavily reliant on who you interact with. Violence works its way through these direct and indirect personal connections, often leaving the rest of the geographic community completely untouched. Section 3. Defensive gun use data. We've looked deeply at the criminal element, but what about law-abiding citizens? This right here is one of the most highly contested areas of public policy statistics. There is a massive discrepancy in the data here. On one hand, the government's National Crime Victimization Survey estimates that firearms are used defensively about 64,000 times a year.
On the other hand, a wide range of private surveys estimate defensive gun uses to be anywhere from 1 million to up to 2.9 million times every single year. That is a millions-wide gap. This matters because it dramatically changes the statistical picture of how often firearms act as a protective measure versus a criminal tool.
So why do these numbers differ so wildly? Well, it all comes down to methodology. The NCVS is a non-anonymous survey conducted by the federal government. It asks open-ended questions about what a victim did to protect themselves without specifically prompting them about firearms. A lot of criminologists point out that people might naturally be hesitant to confess to a federal agent that they pulled a weapon on someone, especially in jurisdictions where carrying it might be legally gray. Private surveys, however, are totally anonymous and directly ask respondents if they have specifically used a gun for defense. We aren't here to declare one strictly right or wrong, but understanding how the data is gathered explains the massive variance in how we measure self-defense. Section 4. Evaluating policy interventions. Let's look dispassionately at what the raw data actually says about the effectiveness of macro-level gun policies. The RAND Corporation conducted a massive, rigorous literature review on how different policies affect mass shootings, and the results are fascinatingly nuanced. They found evidence that bans on assault weapons and high-capacity magazines, along with licensing requirements, may decrease mass shootings. However, for a whole host of other popular proposals like universal background checks, concealed carry laws, and waiting periods, the evidence remains completely inconclusive. The science simply hasn't proven them to be definitively effective or ineffective for preventing mass public shootings at this time. And to put policy into historical context, let's look at the 1994 federal assault weapons ban. Prior to that federal ban being enacted, assault weapons accounted for roughly 2% of crime guns. While the ban targeted these specific military-style weapons, which, yes, do have the capacity for rapid fire, the data shows they represented a very small fraction of overall gun violence. The vast majority of gun crime is, and historically has been, committed with handguns. It perfectly illustrates the highly targeted scope of that specific intervention compared to the wider ocean of everyday crime. Which brings us to our final thought. The data we've explored today is incredibly complex, from the 10-year lifespan of a black market gun, to the 1.4% of city blocks where violence actually lives, to the potentially millions of defensive gun uses every year. So here is the question to leave you with. How might a strictly data-driven approach change the way we design future public safety policies? If we rely solely on these raw statistics instead of partisan talking points, what solutions actually emerge? I highly encourage you to check the pinned sources below, read the data for yourself, and drop a comment with your take. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning the data.